The truth about a man is usually revealed long before anyone learns his name. The red and blue reflections from police cruisers danced across the fuel pumps of a busy gas station just outside Richmond, Virginia, as dozens of strangers stopped what they were doing to watch an uncomfortable scene unfold. Cars remained parked beside the pumps. Drivers stood frozen beside half-filled tanks. A delivery driver lowered a cardboard box onto the pavement and stared. Near the convenience store entrance, customers gathered behind the glass windows, trying to understand why several police officers had surrounded a single man wearing an expensive charcoal suit. Nathaniel Brooks stood beside his dark gray sedan with both hands visible and his expression calm. At 59 years old, he carried himself with the quiet confidence of someone who had spent decades making difficult decisions. His silver hair was neatly trimmed. His polished dress shoes reflected the bright station lights overhead. A leather briefcase rested on the hood of his vehicle where he had placed it moments earlier. Nothing about him appeared threatening. Nothing about him seemed unusual. Yet the atmosphere surrounding him suggested otherwise. Officer Kyle Morgan stood a few feet away, his posture firm and his attention fixed entirely on Nathaniel. Kyle had worked patrol for years and trusted his instincts. Earlier that evening, a report had reached dispatch involving a vehicle similar to Nathaniel's. The information was incomplete, but it was enough to place Kyle on alert. When he spotted the sedan pulling into the gas station, he decided to investigate. What began as a routine encounter quickly attracted attention. People noticed the police vehicles. Then they noticed the man standing beside them. Soon everyone nearby had formed an opinion despite knowing almost nothing about the situation. Nathaniel could feel the weight of those assumptions pressing against him from every direction. A young couple whispered near the ice machine. A teenager recorded video from across the parking lot. An elderly man standing beside pump number 6 shook his head as if he had already reached a conclusion. Nathaniel had experienced moments like this before. Not the exact circumstances, but the familiar feeling of being judged before being understood. Kyle reviewed information on a tablet while another officer spoke quietly into a radio. The station lights cast long shadows across the concrete. Somewhere in the distance, thunder rolled beyond the horizon, though the sky remained clear above the city. The air felt heavy. Time seemed to move slower with every passing minute. Nathaniel remained respectful. He answered every question calmly. He provided identification when asked. He offered no resistance, no anger, and no argument. Still, the uncertainty lingered. The crowd continued growing. More people stopped to watch. Some looked curious. Others looked suspicious. Few appeared willing to consider that they might be witnessing a misunderstanding. Kyle glanced at Nathaniel again. Something about the man's composure felt unusual. Most people became nervous under this kind of attention. Nathaniel appeared almost peaceful. Yet Kyle pushed the thought aside and continued following procedure. Nearby, a little girl holding her mother's hand looked up at Nathaniel and asked a simple question that nobody else seemed willing to ask. "Mom, what did he do?" Her mother hesitated before answering because the truth was she did not know. No one there knew. Not the crowd. Not the bystanders. Not even the officers. But as the evening shadows stretched across the gas station and more police vehicles arrived, one thing became clear. The next 24 hours were about to change the lives of everyone involved. The questions continued long after most people expected the situation to end. The gas station lights glowed against the darkening Virginia sky, while the evening crowd remained unusually interested in a man they had never met. Nathaniel Brooks stood quietly beside his sedan as officers reviewed documents, exchanged information, and spoke with dispatch. Through it all, he remained remarkably composed. His calmness was not the calmness of someone who believed he was above the situation. It was the calmness of someone who had spent a lifetime understanding that character is often tested when circumstances feel unfair. Earlier that morning, Nathaniel had been sitting in a conference room filled with attorneys, legal scholars, and community leaders. The event had focused on equal access to justice and the responsibilities carried by those who serve the public. He had spoken thoughtfully about fairness, accountability, and the importance of treating every person with dignity regardless of appearance, income, or background. The audience had listened carefully. Many of them considered him one of the most respected legal minds in the state. Now, only hours later, He found himself standing beneath fluorescent gas station lights while strangers whispered theories about who he might be. The contrast was almost surreal. Yet Nathaniel showed no bitterness. He understood something many people never learned. Public opinion can change in a moment. Principles should not. Across the parking lot, a woman watched from inside her vehicle while her teenage son sat beside her. The boy kept glancing toward Nathaniel. There was confusion in his eyes. He could not understand why a man dressed like a successful professional was receiving so much attention from law enforcement. Nearby, a truck driver folded his arms and leaned against a fuel pump. Several customers entering and leaving the convenience store slowed down to observe. The crowd had created its own story despite having almost no facts. Nathaniel noticed the looks. He noticed the assumptions. Most importantly, he noticed how quickly people seemed willing to accept a narrative before evidence appeared. The experience reminded him of lessons learned decades earlier. Growing up, he had watched his parents work tirelessly to build opportunities that did not come easily. They taught him that dignity was not something granted by others. It came from within. Their words stayed with him through law school, through years of legal practice, and through every professional achievement that followed. Those lessons remained with him now. Officer Kyle Morgan continued reviewing information while occasionally looking toward Nathaniel. Something about the encounter felt increasingly unusual. The records being returned through dispatch were not creating a clear picture. Instead, every answer seemed to raise additional questions. Nathaniel's identification was valid. His vehicle registration was valid. Nothing suggested the situation was as straightforward as Kyle originally believed. Yet uncertainty lingered. The station lights reflected across the polished surface of the sedan as a cool evening breeze swept through the parking lot. Nathaniel adjusted his suit jacket and looked toward the horizon where city lights shimmered in the distance. Unknown to everyone gathered there, the next day would reveal a truth none of them expected. For now, however, he remained simply a quiet man standing beneath the lights, waiting patiently while others decided who they believed he was. Officer Kyle Morgan had built his reputation on confidence. Fellow officers respected him because he rarely hesitated when making decisions. Supervisors appreciated his willingness to act quickly. In Kyle's mind, experience had taught him that uncertainty could be dangerous. The problem was that confidence and certainty were not always the same thing. As the evening continued at the gas station, he found himself confronting a situation that no longer fit the assumptions he had formed when the encounter began. The information arriving from dispatch seemed ordinary at first. Then it became increasingly difficult to explain. Every document connected to Nathaniel Brooks appeared legitimate. His driver's license was valid. His vehicle registration matched perfectly. His insurance information was current. Even the professional credentials attached to various records suggested a man with an established and respected career. Yet Kyle remained caught between the first impression he had formed and the evidence accumulating in front of him. Around the parking lot, the crowd continued watching. Human curiosity had transformed a routine stop into a public spectacle. Some people believed the officers must know something serious. Others believed Nathaniel was being treated unfairly. Few recognized how little information anyone actually possessed. The bright station lights reflected off nearby vehicles while customers moved in and out of the convenience store carrying coffee cups, bottled drinks, and grocery bags. Ordinary life continued only a few feet away from a moment that felt increasingly extraordinary. Kyle glanced toward Nathaniel again. The older man remained calm. There was no visible frustration, no attempt to draw attention to himself, no effort to influence the officers through status or connections. That detail bothered Kyle more than he expected. Most people in stressful situations tried to defend themselves aggressively or demanded immediate explanations. Nathaniel simply waited. The composure seemed almost deliberate. It suggested a man accustomed to pressure, a man who understood that emotional reactions often reveal more than facts. Nearby, another officer quietly approached Kyle and shared updated information from dispatch. The conversation lasted less than a minute, but it left Kyle thinking. Nothing they had learned justified the growing level of suspicion surrounding Nathaniel. In fact, the opposite seemed increasingly true. The more information they reviewed, the more difficult it became to understand why the situation felt so significant in the first place. Across the parking lot, A television mounted above the convenience store counter displayed a late evening news broadcast. Most people ignored it. Nathaniel noticed it briefly before returning his attention to the officers. The station lights cast soft reflections across his suit jacket as a cool breeze moved through the area. He looked less like someone involved in a police investigation and more like a respected professional delayed on his way home from an important meeting. Cal felt a growing discomfort he could not easily explain. It was not fear. It was not doubt about procedure. It was the realization that first impressions can become powerful stories inside a person's mind. Once those stories take hold, evidence sometimes struggles to catch up. As the night deepened and the crowd slowly began thinning, neither Kyle nor the bystanders realized they were witnessing the final hours before a revelation that would transform the entire encounter. Within 24 hours, the balance of authority everyone took for granted would look completely different. By the time the situation at the gas station finally began winding down, the night air had grown cooler and the crowd had thinned considerably. Most people eventually returned to their lives once they realized no dramatic conclusion was coming. A few vehicles pulled away from the pumps. The convenience store emptied. The flashing reflections from police lights became less noticeable against the darkness settling over Richmond. Yet for Nathaniel Brooks, the evening left an impression that would not disappear quickly. After answering every question and cooperating fully, he was finally allowed to leave. No charges were filed. No wrongdoing was discovered. Officially, the matter seemed resolved. Unofficially, however, something lingered beneath the surface. Nathaniel placed his briefcase in the passenger seat and sat quietly behind the steering wheel before starting the engine. For a few moments, he simply listened to the soft hum of the vehicle and watched the station through the windshield. Officer Kyle Morgan remained outside speaking with another officer. Their conversation appeared routine, but Kyle occasionally glanced toward Nathaniel's car. There was something unsettled in his expression. The certainty he carried at the beginning of the encounter had faded. In its place was a feeling he could not quite define. Nathaniel eventually pulled away from the gas station and merged onto the highway leading toward downtown Richmond. The city lights stretched across the horizon like scattered stars. Inside the vehicle, the atmosphere felt peaceful. He loosened his tie slightly and turned on a classical music station. The familiar melodies filled the cabin as he drove through the quiet Virginia night. Yet his thoughts remained focused on the events of the evening. He was not angry. Years of experience had taught him that anger rarely solved anything. Instead, he found himself reflecting on how quickly assumptions form and how stubbornly they resist evidence. Long before anyone knows who a person is, people often decide who they believe that person must be. Meanwhile, back at the gas station, Kyle completed paperwork. Inside his patrol vehicle, the computer screen illuminated his face as he reviewed the final report. Everything pointed toward the same conclusion. The encounter had produced no evidence of criminal activity. Still, he could not stop thinking about Nathaniel. Most citizens subjected to prolonged public scrutiny would have shown frustration. Nathaniel had displayed patience. Most would have demanded explanations. Nathaniel had remained respectful. Most importantly, Kyle realized he knew almost nothing about the man despite spending hours focused on him. That realization bothered him more than he expected. Near midnight, Nathaniel arrived at his hotel. The elegant building overlooked the James River, where city lights reflected softly across the water. After checking in, he rode the elevator to his room and placed his briefcase beside the desk. Through the large window, Richmond glowed beneath the night sky. Tomorrow would be important. A full day of court proceedings awaited. Dozens of attorneys, clerks, and public officials would gather for scheduled hearings. Nathaniel reviewed several case files before preparing for bed. As he organized documents across the desk, one folder rested near the top of the stack. It contained materials for the first hearing scheduled the following morning. Neither Nathaniel nor Kyle realized it yet, but their paths were about to cross again in a place where authority carried a very different meaning. Morning arrived beneath a pale Virginia sky as Richmond slowly awakened around the James River. Inside the elegant courthouse downtown, employees prepared for another ordinary day of hearings, filings, and legal arguments. Security officers greeted attorneys entering through the front doors. Clerks organized documents. Court reporters reviewed schedules. Everything appeared routine. Yet several miles away, Officer Kyle Morgan woke with an unusual feeling that had followed him since leaving the gas station the night before. He could not explain it. The encounter should have disappeared into memory like hundreds of others throughout his career. Instead, Nathaniel Brooks remained on his mind. While preparing for work, Kyle replayed details he could not seem to forget. The calm voice, the patience, the complete absence of hostility. Most people placed under public scrutiny carried visible frustration afterward. Nathaniel had carried dignity. That difference lingered. By mid-morning, Kyle arrived at the courthouse to attend a scheduled legal proceeding connected to departmental responsibilities. It was not an important appearance. He expected little more than routine administrative matters before returning to patrol duty. The courthouse lobby bustled with attorneys carrying briefcases and clients quietly waiting on wooden benches. Sunlight streamed through tall windows, illuminating marble floors polished by decades of footsteps. Kyle signed in and proceeded toward the assigned courtroom. Meanwhile, several floors above, Nathaniel Brooks reviewed the final documents for the morning docket. The previous evening already felt distant. He had slept well. He had exercised before sunrise. He had spent an hour reading through case materials while drinking coffee beside the hotel window overlooking the river. His focus now rested entirely on the responsibilities awaiting him inside the courtroom. The law demanded concentration. Personal experiences could not influence judgment. That principle guided every decision he made. Back downstairs, Kyle entered the courtroom and took a seat near the rear. Attorneys quietly arranged files on counsel tables. Spectators filled several rows. The atmosphere carried the familiar formality found in courtrooms across America. Yet something felt different. More officials seemed present than usual. Several lawyers spoke in hushed voices while glancing toward the bench. Kyle checked his watch. Proceedings would begin shortly. As minutes passed, the room gradually settled into silence. The court clerk organized paperwork. The bailiff moved toward the front of the room. Conversation stopped. Chairs shifted. Everyone rose to their feet as the clerk prepared to announce the arrival of the presiding judge. Kyle stood with the rest of the courtroom, his attention focused casually toward the entrance behind the bench. He expected another routine morning, another familiar face, another ordinary day. Then the door opened. A figure emerged wearing the traditional black judicial robe. The courtroom immediately became still. Kyle's expression froze. For a brief moment, he believed his eyes were deceiving him. The man walking confidently toward the bench looked unmistakably familiar. The silver hair, the composed posture, the calm presence. Every detail matched the person who had stood beneath the gas station lights less than 24 hours earlier. Nathaniel Brooks ascended the steps and took his seat. The entire courtroom remained standing in respectful silence. Kyle felt the air leave his lungs as realization crashed over him. The stranger he thought he understood was not merely a respected professional. He was the very judge about to preside over the courtroom. For several long seconds, Officer Kyle Morgan could not move. He remained standing with everyone else in the courtroom as Nathaniel Brooks settled into the judge's chair high above the floor. The polished wood, the state seal mounted behind the bench, and the respectful silence throughout the room suddenly transformed the memory of the gas station into something entirely different. Less than 24 hours earlier, Nathaniel had stood beneath fluorescent lights while strangers questioned who he was. Now an entire courtroom stood in recognition of the answer. The court clerk began reading the opening announcements, but Kyle barely heard the words. His thoughts remained fixed on the previous evening. He remembered the crowd. He remembered the assumptions. Most of all, he remembered the certainty he had carried into the encounter before facts had fully arrived. Nathaniel, meanwhile, displayed no sign that anything unusual had occurred. His expression remained composed and professional. He reviewed documents placed before him and greeted attorneys with the same calm courtesy he extended to everyone else. If he recognized Kyle sitting near the back of the room, he gave no indication. The proceedings began precisely on schedule. Case after case moved through the courtroom with remarkable efficiency. Lawyers presented arguments. Witnesses answered questions. Administrative matters were addressed. Throughout it all, Nathaniel demonstrated the qualities that had earned him a respected reputation throughout Virginia. He listened carefully. He treated every participant with dignity. He remained patient even when discussions became complicated. As Kyle watched, a realization slowly settled over him. The man on the bench was exactly the same person he had encountered at the gas station. The difference was not Nathaniel. The difference was context. Yesterday, people saw a black man standing beside a vehicle. Today, they saw a judge seated beneath the seal of the court. The person had not changed. Only the assumptions surrounding him had changed. The thought was difficult to ignore. Sunlight streamed through tall courtroom windows, illuminating particles of dust drifting quietly through the air. The room felt almost timeless. Every sound seemed softer than normal. Every movement appeared more deliberate. Nathaniel occasionally glanced toward the gallery while reviewing case materials. Each time, Kyle found himself reflecting on how little he had known about the man when they first met. Authority had a strange way of influencing perception. Titles influence perception. Clothing influence perception. Yet true character existed before any of those things became visible. As the morning progressed, the weight of that lesson continued growing. During a brief recess, attorneys gathered in the hallway discussing legal matters. Court staff moved between offices carrying folders and documents. Kyle remained seated, staring quietly toward the empty bench. The room suddenly felt larger than before. He remembered the little girl at the gas station asking her mother what Nathaniel had done. The question had seemed simple at the time. Now it carried a different meaning. Nobody knew who Nathaniel truly was. They only knew what they assumed. The courtroom doors eventually opened again as participants returned to their seats. Nathaniel re-entered moments later, calm and focused as ever. The proceedings resumed. Yet for Kyle, something fundamental had already changed. The most important judgment delivered that day had not come from the bench. It had come from the quiet realization forming inside his own conscience. The morning session eventually came to an end, but the impact of what Officer Kyle Morgan had witnessed continued growing with every passing minute. When the court recessed for lunch, attorneys gathered in the hallways discussing upcoming hearings while courthouse employees moved efficiently between offices. The atmosphere remained professional and orderly. Yet Kyle felt as though he were seeing the building through entirely new eyes. The realization that had begun inside the courtroom was no longer a surprise. It had become something deeper. Reflection. Standing near a tall window overlooking downtown Richmond, Kyle watched pedestrians move along the sidewalks far below. The city appeared ordinary. People hurried to meetings. Cars stopped at traffic lights. Construction crews worked beneath the bright afternoon sun. Life continued exactly as it had the previous day. The difference was not outside. The difference was inside him. Less than 24 hours earlier, he had encountered Nathaniel Brooks beneath the harsh lights of a gas station. Today, he had watched the same man preside over a courtroom with intelligence, patience, and unquestioned professionalism. The contrast forced him to confront an uncomfortable truth. Somewhere between first impressions and final conclusions, he had allowed assumptions to influence judgment. Inside chambers, Nathaniel reviewed documents while preparing for the afternoon docket. Through years on the bench, he had learned that fairness required discipline. Every person who entered a courtroom carried a story. Some stories were obvious. Others remained hidden beneath appearance, reputation, or circumstance. The responsibility of a judge was not to guess. It was to listen. That principle guided every decision he made. Eventually, as the afternoon session concluded, courthouse corridors began emptying. Attorneys departed. Clerks organized files for the following day. Sunlight streamed through the windows, casting long golden reflections across polished floors. Kyle remained near the courtroom entrance, uncertain whether he should leave or stay. A part of him wanted to walk away and pretend the previous evening had never happened. Another part knew he could not. Some lessons become too important to ignore. As people gradually dispersed, Nathaniel emerged from a side hallway carrying a leather portfolio. Without the judicial robe, he appeared much like he had at the gas station. The same measured walk, the same calm expression, the same quiet confidence. For a brief moment, their eyes met. Kyle felt his pulse quicken. Nathaniel paused. Neither man spoke immediately. The silence between them contained far more meaning than words could easily express. Finally, Kyle stepped forward. The confidence that once came so naturally now felt replaced by humility. He understood that the authority he carried as a police officer did not protect him from mistakes. If anything, it required him to acknowledge them. Nathaniel waited patiently, giving him the same courtesy he had demonstrated from the beginning. The afternoon sunlight illuminated the hallway behind them, while courthouse employees moved quietly in the distance. It was not a dramatic scene. There were no spectators, no reporters, no crowd. Yet it was perhaps the most important moment of the entire experience. Because for the first time since the encounter began, Kyle was no longer focused on procedure, reports, or appearances. He was focused on truth. And the truth standing before him was a man whose character had remained unchanged whether he was beneath gas station lights or seated behind the bench of a courtroom. For a moment, neither man spoke. The courthouse hallway seemed unusually quiet as the last rays of afternoon sunlight stretched across the marble floor. Officer Kyle Morgan finally broke the silence. His voice carried none of the certainty that had defined him at the gas station. Instead, it carried honesty. He admitted that he had spent the entire day thinking about the previous evening. He admitted that seeing Nathaniel Brooks on the bench had forced him to question assumptions he had never fully examined before. Nathaniel listened without interruption. His expression remained calm, neither satisfied nor resentful. When Kyle finished speaking, the judge nodded. Thoughtfully. He did not lecture. He did not remind Kyle of his authority. He did not mention the embarrassment of standing beneath the gas station lights while strangers watched and speculated. Instead, he spoke quietly about responsibility. He explained that every profession carried power of some kind. Judges possessed power. Police officers possessed power. Teachers possessed power. Parents possessed power. The real challenge, he said, was using that power fairly when emotions, assumptions, and first impressions tried to interfere. Kyle listened carefully. The words felt heavier because they came without accusation. Nathaniel could have chosen anger. He could have chosen bitterness. Yet he chose something far more difficult. He chose understanding. The conversation continued as they slowly walked toward the courthouse entrance. Outside, Richmond glowed beneath the warm colors of late afternoon. Traffic moved steadily through downtown streets. Pedestrians crossed intersections beneath changing lights. Life continued as normal, unaware that two men were sharing a conversation neither would forget. Kyle admitted that when he first saw Nathaniel at the gas station, he believed he understood the situation almost immediately. Nathaniel smiled gently at that confession. Then he shared a lesson learned during his earliest years practicing law. The most dangerous mistakes, he explained, rarely came from bad intentions. They came from certainty arriving before understanding. Those words settled deeply into Kyle's mind. They explained something he had struggled to articulate all day. The problem had never been procedure. The problem had been the story he unconsciously created before the facts were complete. Near the courthouse steps, they stopped walking. The evening air felt cooler now. Long shadows stretched across the sidewalk. For the first time since the encounter began, Kyle felt a sense of clarity replacing his discomfort. Nathaniel extended his hand. The gesture surprised him. There was no judgment in it. No desire to establish superiority. Only respect. Kyle shook his hand firmly. The moment lasted only seconds, yet it carried the weight of something much larger. It represented accountability without humiliation, correction without revenge, growth without hostility. As they parted ways, Nathaniel descended the courthouse steps toward the waiting city beyond. Kyle remained standing near the entrance, watching him disappear into the flow of pedestrians below. He realized that the most powerful person he had met in the last 24 hours was not powerful because of a title, a courtroom, or a judicial robe. He was powerful because when given every reason to respond with anger, he chose grace instead. The following morning arrived with the quiet confidence that only a clear Virginia sunrise could bring. Golden light spilled across the James River and reflected from the glass buildings of downtown Richmond. People hurried toward offices carrying coffee cups and briefcases. Students crossed campus walkways. Traffic moved steadily through the city. To most people, it was simply another ordinary day. Yet for two men, something important had changed forever. Nathaniel Brooks arrived at the courthouse before most employees. He greeted security officers by name, exchanged a few friendly words with courthouse staff, and walked calmly through familiar hallways. There was nothing dramatic about his routine. The same humility that had guided him throughout his career remained unchanged. He reviewed case files, prepared for hearings, and focused on the responsibilities waiting before him. The previous evening at the gas station already felt distant, not because it lacked importance, but because Nathaniel understood something many people never learned. A person's future should never become a prisoner of someone else's misunderstanding. Meanwhile, Officer Kyle Morgan began his shift across town. The patrol vehicle looked the same. The uniform felt the same. The radio traffic sounded the same. Yet he knew he was not exactly the same man who had parked beneath those gas station lights 2 days earlier. Throughout the morning, he found himself paying closer attention than before. He listened longer. He questioned assumptions faster. He reminded himself that every person he encountered carried a story that could not be understood. Through appearance alone, the lesson Nathaniel had taught without anger remained with him. Days turned into weeks. Weeks gradually became months. Richmond continued moving through seasons. Summer sunlight gave way to autumn colors. Leaves drifted across courthouse steps and city sidewalks. Life continued, yet the memory never disappeared. One afternoon, while driving past the same gas station where everything had begun, Kyle slowed briefly at the traffic light. The pumps looked ordinary. Customers moved between vehicles and the convenience store. No crowd stood watching. No police vehicles filled the parking lot. The place appeared completely unremarkable. Yet Kyle smiled quietly to himself. It was remarkable, because that ordinary location had become the place where he learned one of the most valuable lessons of his career. Several miles away, Nathaniel stood near a courthouse window after concluding another day of hearings. The late afternoon sun illuminated the city skyline beyond the glass. He watched people moving through the streets below and reflected on how often life presented opportunities to choose understanding over judgment. Sometimes those opportunities arrived inside a courtroom. Sometimes they arrived in everyday places where nobody expected them. The difference was whether people recognized them when they appeared. Outside, a gentle breeze moved through the trees lining the courthouse plaza. The sounds of the city softened beneath the warm glow of evening. Nathaniel gathered his files and prepared to leave. As he stepped through the courthouse doors, sunlight touched the stone steps beneath his feet. Across the street, people passed by without recognizing the significance of the man walking among them. Nathaniel preferred it that way. True dignity did not require recognition. It simply required consistency. He descended the steps and disappeared into the rhythm of the city while the evening light stretched across Richmond. Above him, the sky glowed gold and blue. Around him, life continued forward. And in the quiet space between assumption and understanding, justice remained exactly where it belonged.